Nathaniel Hawthorne entered the grand lakefront hotel, carrying a bouquet meant for a bride. In the lobby below, Felicity Hawthorne watched him step into the elevator. The staff moved quietly around them, arranging white roses and candles for a small ceremony upstairs. Someone at the front desk smiled and said the bride was already waiting. Nathaniel pressed the button for the top floor. Felicity already knew. Upstairs in a room filled with lace and wedding light, the woman wearing the white dress was not a stranger. Her name was Emily Hawthorne. She was Felicity's younger sister, and Nathaniel was about to marry her. Before we begin the full story, take a moment to pause with me. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world tonight, tell me where you are and what your local time is in the comments. It's always powerful to see how far stories like this travel. And if you believe that truth, dignity, and quiet strength still matter, consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss the rest of this story. Because what Felicity Hawthorne did next was not loud, but it was unforgettable. From the outside, the marriage between Felicity Hawthorne and Nathaniel Hawthorne appeared steady in the way certain American marriages often do, orderly, respectable, and quiet enough that no one thought to question it. They lived in a pale gray house on a calm suburban street just outside Chicago, where the trees were older than most of the houses and the sidewalks curved gently around small, careful lawns. In the evenings, porch lights came on at almost the same hour. On weekends, neighbors walked their dogs past one another and exchanged polite greetings about weather traffic and property taxes. Felicity Hawthorne fit naturally into that landscape. She was 36 years old, composed and deliberate in her movements. Her work as an archival researcher suited her temperament perfectly. She spent her days examining records, organizing documents, and preserving information that other people might overlook. Precision had become part of the way she saw the world. Details rarely escaped her for long. Nathaniel often joked that Felicity could remember things computers forgot. The joke usually earned a polite smile from her, though she never laughed very loudly. Nathaniel Hawthorne, by contrast, moved through the world with a practiced ease. At 41, he worked as a corporate consultant for a mid-sized logistics firm downtown. His job required him to present solutions, negotiate contracts, and maintain relationships with people who expected confidence. He had the kind of voice that sounded calm, even when it wasn't. Tall, neatly dressed, and careful about how he appeared in public, Nathaniel had always understood the value of reputation. Friends described him as reliable. Colleagues called him persuasive. Family members, especially Felicity's parents, referred to him as a good man. He had married Felicity 9 years earlier. The wedding had taken place in a small stone church near Lake Michigan. Nothing extravagant, just soft music, close relatives, and a quiet reception afterward where people lingered over long conversations rather than loud dancing. For many years afterward, nothing dramatic disturbed the rhythm of their life. And that was exactly how Nathaniel preferred it. Their house contained the signs of stability that reassured outsiders, framed photographs. From vacations, neatly arranged bookshelves, matching dining chairs chosen carefully by Felicity. On Sunday mornings, they drank coffee together in the kitchen while the light moved slowly across the wooden table. They rarely argued in front of anyone. They rarely argued at all. But the absence of conflict is not the same thing as the presence of truth. The Hawthorne family, like many families, had its quiet hierarchies and histories. Felicity was the older daughter of Linda and Thomas Hawthorne, both retired teachers who had spent decades encouraging patience, responsibility, and self-control in their children. Felicity had absorbed those lessons deeply. She believed in order and effort and careful decisions made slowly. Emily Hawthorne, her younger sister, had grown up differently. 7 years separated them. By the time Emily reached high school, Felicity had already left home for college. Their childhood memories overlapped only partially, like two photographs taken years apart in the same place. Emily possessed a kind of brightness that drew attention easily. She laughed louder, spoke faster, and rarely hesitated before acting. Where Felicity preferred certainty, Emily preferred possibility. Their differences did not create hostility between them. If anything, they created a strange balance. Felicity had always helped Emily. When Emily struggled financially during her early 20s, Felicity had quietly transferred money more than once. When Emily moved to Chicago looking for work, Felicity allowed her to stay in the guest room for several months. Nathaniel had welcomed her warmly during that time. At least, that was how it had appeared. He often spoke to Emily with an older brother's patience, offering career advice and introductions to professional contacts. When Felicity worked late, Nathaniel and Emily sometimes cooked dinner together in the kitchen. Felicity would come home to the smell of food and the sound of their voices drifting down the hallway. Nothing about those evenings had seemed unusual then. If Felicity noticed the way Emily admired Nathaniel's confidence, she never mentioned it. If Nathaniel noticed how easily Emily laughed at his stories, he never said so either. The arrangement ended after Emily found an apartment across the city. She thanked Felicity repeatedly for the help and promised she would visit often. And she did. At first, those visits were ordinary. Sunday lunches, birthday dinners, occasional evenings when Emily dropped by with wine and stories about work. Nathaniel always behaved as he had before, pleasant, attentive, measured. But slow changes rarely announce themselves. They accumulate quietly. The first shifts were small enough to dismiss. Nathaniel began returning home slightly later from work. His explanations were reasonable, unexpected meetings, delayed conference calls, a client visiting from another state. His phone started resting face down on the kitchen counter. At night, when messages arrived, the screen would glow briefly before going dark again. Felicity noticed these things the way she noticed everything else, without drama, without accusation. Simply as observations. Emily's visits continued as well, though their timing grew slightly less predictable. Sometimes she arrived when Nathaniel happened to be home early. Other times she stopped by while Felicity was still at work, leaving only a brief message afterward to say she had come and gone. None of this created a scene. No voices were raised. No questions demanded answers. But Felicity Hawthorne had spent her professional life studying records. She understood patterns better than most people understood conversations. And patterns were beginning to form. The first time she truly paused was on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Nathaniel had told her earlier that day he would be working late downtown. Felicity had prepared dinner anyway, placing 2 plates on the table out of habit before eventually putting one away. At 9:17 p.m., while clearing the dishes, she heard the sound of Nathaniel's car in the driveway. When he entered the kitchen, he looked exactly as he always did after work, slightly tired, polite, composed. But Felicity noticed something small, the faint scent of a restaurant she recognized from downtown Chicago. Nathaniel had said he had eaten at his desk. He kissed her on the cheek and thanked her for keeping dinner warm. Felicity smiled. She did not mention the restaurant. She did not mention the time. She did not mention the scent. Instead, later that night, after Nathaniel had gone upstairs, she opened her laptop at the kitchen table. There was no anger in her movements, no rush, just the quiet, familiar patience of someone who knew that truth, once documented carefully enough, rarely needed to shout. Somewhere upstairs, Nathaniel Hawthorne believed his marriage was continuing exactly as it always had. And in a way, he was correct. Felicity Hawthorne was still silent, still calm, still watching. What Nathaniel did not yet understand was that Felicity Hawthorne had already begun doing what she had always done best. She was keeping records. Patterns rarely announce themselves all at once. They arrive quietly disguised as coincidence, until enough of them gather together that coincidence begins to feel unlikely. For Felicity Hawthorne, the shift began not with suspicion, but with documentation. The night Nathaniel returned home, smelling faintly of a downtown restaurant he claimed he had never visited, Felicity opened her laptop and created a new document. She titled it simply Calendar Notes. It was not an accusation. It was a record. Felicity wrote down the date, the time Nathaniel had arrived home, the explanation he had given earlier that day about working late. Then she added a short note about the restaurant scent she recognized. After that, she closed the laptop. There was no confrontation waiting upstairs. No tense conversation before bed. Nathaniel slept well that night. Over the following weeks, Felicity added more entries to the document. Most of them were small, Nathaniel leaving earlier than usual on certain mornings. Unexpected evening meetings that appeared suddenly on his schedule. Phone calls taken outside on the back porch where the wind carried his voice away before it could reach the kitchen window. None of these things were dramatic on their own. Nathaniel's work as a consultant often required flexibility, and Felicity understood the unpredictable nature of corporate schedules. But Felicity Hawthorne had spent 15 years examining archives and historical records. She had studied documents written centuries apart and still recognized when two stories did not quite match. It was not the individual details that troubled her. It was the repetition. One evening in early April, Nathaniel mentioned that he would be traveling for work the following Thursday. A client meeting in Milwaukee, he explained casually while scrolling through his phone at the dinner table. Just one night, he said. I'll be back Friday afternoon. Felicity nodded. The information seemed ordinary enough. 2 days later, while organizing email folders on her laptop, Felicity noticed a message from their joint bank account. The subject line read, "Transaction Confirmation." The charge had been made at a boutique hotel in downtown Chicago, not Milwaukee. The payment time was Thursday evening. The same evening, Nathaniel was supposed to be 3 hours away. Felicity did not react immediately. She read the email twice, noting the hotel name and the exact amount charged. Then she opened the document titled Calendar Notes and added another entry. Thursday, 7:42 p.m., hotel charge downtown. Nathaniel said Milwaukee. After that, she closed the laptop again. When Nathaniel returned home the next afternoon, he carried a small overnight bag and spoke casually about traffic along the interstate. He described the meeting in Milwaukee, the client's frustration with shipping delays, the long drive back toward Chicago. The story was detailed. Nathaniel had always been good at constructing explanations. Felicity listened while preparing tea. She did not interrupt. She did not mention the hotel charge. And Nathaniel, watching her calm expression, saw nothing that suggested his story had been recorded somewhere already. Weeks passed. Spring settled over the suburbs, bringing warmer evenings and longer daylight. Neighbors began tending their gardens again. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks after school. Inside the Hawthorne house, life continued with its familiar, quiet rhythm. Nathaniel left for work each morning in a pressed shirt and dark jacket. Felicity spent her days reviewing digital archives for the historical foundation that employed her. Their evenings remained polite, even comfortable. But the document on Felicity's laptop grew steadily longer. She began adding not only dates and times, but financial details as well. Restaurant charges, parking receipts, occasional purchases that did not align with Nathaniel's explanations. One afternoon, Felicity met her longtime friend Daniel Brooks for coffee near the university campus, where they had both once studied. Daniel worked as a financial analyst, now a profession that suited his calm, mathematical mind. They spoke first about ordinary things, mutual friends, local news, the strange weather patterns of the Midwest. Eventually, Felicity mentioned the irregularities she'd been noticing. She did not accuse Nathaniel of anything. She simply described the discrepancies. Daniel listened carefully, stirring his coffee slowly as Felicity outlined the dates she had recorded. "You're saying the expenses don't match the travel schedule," he summarized. "Yes." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Do you have copies of the statements?" Felicity opened a folder on her tablet and passed it across the table. Daniel studied the information for several minutes, his brow tightening slightly as he compared the dates. "These aren't random," he said finally. "What do you mean the transactions cluster around specific days? Same locations, same times of evening." He looked up at Felicity. Someone meeting the same person repeatedly tends to create patterns like this. Felicity absorbed the observation quietly. Daniel did not ask the obvious question. He had known Felicity long enough to understand that she would not have come to him if she were not already considering the answer herself. Meanwhile, Emily Hawthorne continued to visit occasionally. Her presence in the house felt almost unchanged. She still arrived with energetic stories about work and city life, still hugged Felicity warmly at the door. But Felicity noticed subtle differences now. Emily often asked about Nathaniel's schedule. Is he working late tonight? Did he travel again this week? The questions were asked casually, almost playfully. Yet Felicity recorded them all the same. One Sunday afternoon in May, Emily joined Felicity for lunch at a small cafe near the river. The restaurant was quiet, filled mostly with couples enjoying the mild weather. Emily seemed distracted that day, glancing at her phone several times during their meal. Everything all right? Felicity asked gently. Yeah, Emily said quickly. Just work stuff. Her answer came too quickly. Felicity noticed the way Emily's expression softened briefly when reading a new message, before she turned the phone screen downward. For a moment, Felicity wondered if she should ask directly. The opportunity existed. The question was simple. Who are you texting? But Felicity had never believed in questions asked without preparation. Instead, she changed the subject. Later that evening, after returning home, Felicity added another entry to the document. Lunch with Emily, phone messages throughout meal. Appeared nervous? The document had grown to several pages now. Dates, times, financial entries, observations. Individually, each note meant very little. Together, they formed something larger. Still, Felicity did not yet know the full shape of what she was documenting. That answer would arrive in an unexpected way several weeks later. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon in early June, Felicity was sorting through a backlog of emails while Nathaniel worked downtown. Most of the messages were routine newsletters, work updates, community notices. But one message stood out. The sender's address was unfamiliar. The subject line read, "Reservation Confirmation." For a moment, Felicity assumed it must be spam. Then she opened it. Inside was a formal confirmation from the Grand Lakefront Hotel, Chicago. The email thanked Nathaniel Hawthorne for reserving a private suite and event space. The purpose listed beneath the reservation details was brief. Private ceremony. The date was only 2 weeks away. Felicity read the message carefully. Once, then again. She noted the suite number, the scheduled time, and the phrase that appeared near the bottom of the message, "Bridal preparation room reserved." Felicity closed the email slowly. For the first time since she had begun recording Nathaniel's inconsistencies, she felt the faint edge of something sharper than curiosity. Not anger, not yet, but the quiet understanding that the story she had been documenting might soon reveal itself completely. She opened the document titled Calendar Notes and began a new entry. The entry Felicity Hawthorne wrote that afternoon was longer than the others. Until that moment, her notes had been brief dates, times quiet observations. The kind of details that meant little on their own, but formed something meaningful when placed together. Now, however, the record required precision. She copied the reservation details from the email carefully, the hotel name, the event suite, the time scheduled for the ceremony, and the mention of the bridal preparation room. She saved the message in a separate folder on her laptop, then downloaded the attached confirmation document as a PDF. When she finished, she sat for several minutes without moving. Outside the kitchen window, the late spring sunlight rested across the backyard lawn. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the street. The sound was ordinary, almost peaceful. Inside the house, Felicity's mind began quietly organizing what she had discovered. Nathaniel had reserved a hotel suite for a private ceremony. The reservation included a bridal preparation room. That meant there was a bride. And if Felicity was not the bride, the question became very simple. Who was? Many people would have confronted their spouse immediately. Many would have demanded explanations before the evening ended. But Felicity Hawthorne had never believed in conclusions drawn too quickly. Evidence she knew required context. She reopened the reservation email and examined it again, this time paying attention to the smaller details: payment information, booking times, contact phone numbers. The credit card listed was one connected to their joint account. The payment date matched one of the unexplained transactions Daniel Brooks had already highlighted. Felicity opened another window on her laptop and logged into their banking portal. She scrolled through the statements until she found the charge again. The amount was larger than a typical hotel stay, large enough to suggest an event reservation rather than a simple room. She added the transaction number to her document. Then she checked the date once more. 2 weeks from now. The ceremony had not happened yet. That meant something important. There was still time. Upstairs, the bedroom door opened as Nathaniel returned home from work earlier than usual that evening. "Fel," he called from the hallway. "I'm in the kitchen," she answered. Nathaniel entered a moment later, loosening his tie as he walked. His expression carried the same relaxed confidence Felicity had known for years. "Traffic wasn't terrible today," he said. "That might be a first." Felicity smiled faintly and poured tea into 2 cups. Nathaniel sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through messages on his phone, while she placed the cup beside him. "Anything interesting happened today?" he asked casually. The question hung in the air for a moment. Felicity considered the email still open on her laptop screen. The reservation. The bridal suite. Nathaniel's name printed neatly across the confirmation. "Nothing unusual," she said calmly. Nathaniel nodded, satisfied with the answer. He sipped his tea, unaware that the confirmation email had already been saved in 3 different places on Felicity's computer. Later that night, after Nathaniel had gone to sleep, Felicity returned to the kitchen. She opened a second document and began creating something new. A timeline. The entries from calendar notes were copied carefully into chronological order. She added the financial transactions Daniel had helped identify and placed the hotel reservation at the center of the timeline. Slowly, a clearer picture began to form. Nathaniel's unexplained evenings, the restaurant charges, the hotel visits downtown, Emily's increasingly curious questions about Nathaniel's schedule. Felicity paused when she reached that part of the timeline. Emily Hawthorne had always been energetic, impulsive, sometimes careless with boundaries. But Felicity had never considered her sister capable of something calculated. Still, the pattern of questions remained. Is Nathaniel home tonight? When is he traveling again? Does he still work late on Thursdays? At the time, Felicity had answered them casually. Now she read those memories differently. The thought appeared slowly, almost reluctantly. Emily might know more than she should. Felicity did not write the thought down. Instead, she opened her phone and searched through her message history with Emily. Most of their conversations were ordinary holiday plans, family updates, small jokes exchanged late at night. But one detail caught Felicity's attention. 3 weeks earlier, Emily had sent a short message on a Thursday evening. "Is Nathaniel still in Milwaukee tonight?" Felicity stared at the message for a long moment. Nathaniel had claimed to be in Milwaukee that evening. But Felicity already knew he had been at a hotel in Chicago. She added the message to the timeline. Across the city, Emily Hawthorne sat in a softly lit apartment, unaware that her text message had just become another piece of evidence. Felicity closed the timeline document and leaned back in her chair. It would have been easy to jump to conclusions. But Felicity had always believed that certainty required patience. There were still questions she needed answered. The reservation email contained a phone number for the hotel's event coordinator. Felicity copied it onto a notepad beside her laptop. She would not call tonight. Conversations asked too early often created warnings. Nathaniel must not know that she had seen the reservation. At least not yet. The next morning passed as normally as any other. Nathaniel left for work shortly after 7, kissing Felicity lightly on the cheek before walking out the door. Felicity watched through the window as his car disappeared down the quiet suburban street. Only when the house had grown completely silent did she pick up her phone. She dialed the hotel number. After 2 rings, a calm voice answered. "Grand Lakefront Hotel Event Services. This is Robert Klein speaking." Felicity spoke gently, choosing her words carefully. "Hello?" I'm calling to confirm details for a private event reservation, scheduled in 2 weeks. Of course, Robert said politely. May I have the reservation name? Felicity paused only briefly. Nathaniel Hawthorne. There was a short pause while Robert checked the booking. Yes, I see it here, he said. Private ceremony reservation, Lakeview Suite. Bridal preparation room included. Felicity felt the quiet certainty of the timeline settling further into place. Is everything set for that evening, she asked. Everything looks confirmed, Robert replied. The bride will be arriving earlier that afternoon for preparation. The bride. Felicity's voice remained steady, and the bride's name Robert hesitated briefly, then answered. Emily Hawthorne. For a moment, the kitchen felt perfectly still. Felicity had suspected many possibilities, but hearing the name spoken aloud carried a finality that documentation alone could not. Emily, her younger sister, the same girl Felicity had helped financially, the same sister who had shared meals at this very table. Nathaniel's ceremony had a bride, and the bride was Emily Hawthorne. Felicity thanked Robert Klein for the confirmation and ended the call politely. Then she returned to the laptop and added the final entry to her timeline. Grand Lakefront Hotel, confirmation call. Bride Emily Hawthorne. When she finished typing, Felicity closed the document slowly. The evidence was no longer a possibility. It was a fact. Upstairs, the bedroom remained exactly as it had always been, Nathaniel's jacket hanging neatly in the closet, the bed still half unmade from the morning. Nothing in the house had changed. And yet, everything had. For several minutes, Felicity sat quietly at the kitchen table. Then she opened a new email. The recipient field contained the name Margaret Collins, family law attorney. Felicity Hawthorne began to write. The email Felicity Hawthorne sent that morning was brief, deliberate, and carefully worded. She did not describe her emotions. She described the facts. A private ceremony reservation at the Grand Lakefront Hotel. A bridal preparation suite booked under the name Emily Hawthorne. Financial transactions drawn from a joint marital account. A timeline of inconsistencies stretching back several months. At the bottom of the message, Felicity added one final sentence. I would like to understand my legal options before confronting either of them. She pressed send. Margaret Collins replied later that afternoon. The message was direct. Miss Hawthorne, thank you for the documentation. I would recommend we meet as soon as possible. Please bring copies of all records you've collected. The following day, Felicity drove downtown to Margaret Collins's office. The building stood among several older law offices near the Chicago River, quiet brick structures where the elevators moved slowly, and the hallways carried the subdued smell of paper and polished wood. Margaret Collins's office reflected the same restrained seriousness. The woman who greeted Felicity in the conference room was in her early 50s, with silver threads beginning to appear in her dark hair. Her posture was calm, her voice measured in a way that suggested she had spent many years listening to complicated stories. Miss Hawthorne, Margaret said, extending her hand. Felicity's fine. Margaret nodded and gestured toward the chair across the table. Please sit. Felicity placed a folder of printed documents on the table and slid it forward. Margaret opened it carefully. Inside were copies of the reservation email bank statements, the timeline Felicity had created, and several screenshots of text messages. Margaret read quietly for several minutes. When she finished, she closed the folder with deliberate care. You've done something many people in your position struggle to do, she said. What is that you documented before reacting? Felicity folded her hands in her lap. I wanted to be certain. Margaret nodded. That's exactly why this information is useful. She turned the folder slightly and tapped one of the printed bank statements. These charges come from a joint account. In Illinois, marital funds used in connection with an extramarital relationship can be legally significant. Felicity listened without interrupting. Margaret continued. The hotel reservation alone doesn't determine the outcome of a divorce. But the pattern you've documented, payments, timelines, communications, creates a picture. A picture of what Margaret's voice remained calm. A pattern of financial dissipation and deception. The word dissipation settled in the room quietly. Margaret explained further. In simple terms, it means one spouse used shared marital assets for purposes unrelated to the marriage. Courts tend to look very closely at those situations. Felicity absorbed the information without visible reaction. Margaret studied her carefully. You've already confirmed the bride's identity, yes. Emily Hawthorne. My sister, Margaret, did not respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back slightly in her chair. In my experience, she said slowly, cases involving family members often become emotionally explosive. Felicity's voice remained even. I'm not planning an explosion. Margaret's gaze sharpened slightly. What are you planning? Felicity considered the question carefully before answering. I want the truth documented. Margaret gave a small nod. That can be arranged. She opened her notebook and began outlining several steps. First, we continue collecting evidence. The reservation email is useful, but it helps if we can establish a consistent timeline of financial transactions connected to the relationship. Felicity slid another sheet across the table. Daniel Brooks had helped organize the transactions earlier that week. Margaret reviewed the page. Restaurant charges, hotel payments, transportation receipts, all connected to dates when Nathaniel had claimed to be elsewhere. Margaret exhaled quietly. This is thorough. That's my job, Felicity said. Margaret's lips curved faintly. Yes, I can see that. She continued writing notes. Second, we'll secure additional confirmation from the hotel if possible. Public areas like lobbies and event entrances often have security cameras. Felicity looked up. Would that matter legally? It could, Margaret replied. If it shows the individuals entering together for the ceremony or related events. Felicity nodded. Margaret added another line to her notes. Third, we review communication records. Emails, text messages, voicemail, anything that establishes intent. Felicity hesitated briefly before speaking again. There is something else. Margaret waited. I believe Nathaniel intends to marry Emily privately before filing for divorce. Margaret raised an eyebrow. That would complicate things. How if he enters another marital agreement while still legally married, it creates additional legal problems for him. The room grew quiet again. Margaret studied Felicity with careful attention. You've been very composed throughout this conversation, she said. Should I not be? Many people would already have confronted them. Felicity shook her head slightly. If I confront them now, they will erase everything. Margaret closed her notebook. That is correct. For a moment, the two women sat in silence. Outside the office window, the Chicago River moved slowly beneath the afternoon light. Margaret finally spoke again. When is the ceremony scheduled? 2 weeks from now. Margaret considered that. Then we have time. Felicity's gaze remained steady. I would like to attend. Margaret blinked once. Attend, yes. Margaret leaned forward slightly. You understand that could be emotionally difficult. I understand. Margaret tapped her pen against the table thoughtfully. Why do you want to be there? Felicity answered without hesitation. Because the evidence will be complete. Margaret studied her client for several seconds. Then she nodded. Very well. She wrote something down in the notebook again. In that case, we prepare carefully. Felicity returned home late that afternoon. Nathaniel's car was already in the driveway. Inside the house, he was sitting in the living room reading emails on his tablet. You're home late, he said when Felicity entered. I had an appointment downtown. Nathaniel looked up. Everything okay? Yes. He studied her expression briefly. Nathaniel had always believed he understood Felicity well. Her calmness had been a constant feature of their marriage. He saw that calmness again now and felt reassured. Good, he said, returning his attention to the tablet. Later that evening, Emily called. Her voice carried the same familiar brightness. Hey, Fel. Are you free next weekend for what? Just dinner, maybe. I've been so busy lately. Felicity leaned against the kitchen counter phone, resting gently against her ear. Of course, she said. Great, I'll text you. Emily hung up moments later. Across the city, she was standing in front of a mirror inside a bridal boutique, examining a white dress under soft lights. Nathaniel stood beside her, adjusting his cufflinks. "You think she suspects anything?" Emily asked quietly. Nathaniel shook his head. "Felicity doesn't think that way." Emily smiled faintly at the mirror. Good. Back in the quiet Hawthorne house, Felicity placed her phone down beside the laptop. She opened the timeline document again. Another entry appeared at the bottom of the page. Meeting with Margaret Collins, legal strategy initiated. Felicity saved the file. Then she closed the laptop. The house remained quiet. Nathaniel believed the secret was still his. Emily believed the wedding was still hers. Neither of them yet understood something that Margaret Collins had already recognized during that meeting downtown. Felicity Hawthorne was not preparing for an argument. She was preparing a case. And when the day of the ceremony arrived, the record would be complete. 2 weeks passed with the slow, careful rhythm of ordinary life. From the outside, nothing in the Hawthorne household appeared different. Nathaniel continued leaving for work each morning in pressed shirts and polished shoes. Felicity continued preparing breakfast, reviewing archival records on her laptop, and answering emails from the historical foundation that employed her. Evenings remained calm. They still shared quiet dinners. They still spoke politely about work weather and routine matters. Occasionally, Nathaniel would mention a future project at the office or a client he needed to visit. Felicity listened just as she always had. The difference was not visible. It existed only in the documents accumulating quietly inside a folder on her laptop. Margaret Collins had helped Felicity organize the evidence into clear sections: financial records, communication records, timeline analysis, and supporting documentation. Daniel Brooks had contributed detailed financial breakdowns, identifying exactly how much money Nathaniel had withdrawn from their joint account to pay for hotel reservations, restaurant bills, and other unexplained expenses. Margaret had also contacted the Grand Lakefront Hotel discreetly through formal legal inquiry. While privacy laws limited what could be shared, the hotel confirmed something significant. Security cameras monitored the lobby and main event entrance. The recordings were archived. If necessary, they could be requested through proper legal procedure. Felicity printed the confirmation email Margaret sent summarizing that information and placed it inside the folder. Each piece of documentation strengthened the quiet structure she was building. Meanwhile, Nathaniel appeared increasingly relaxed. The closer the ceremony date approached, the more confident he seemed in the normalcy of their life. He laughed easily during dinner conversations. He even suggested a weekend trip later in the summer. "You've been working too hard lately," he told Felicity one evening while washing dishes. "We should get out of the city for a few days." Felicity dried the plates beside him. "That sounds nice," she said. Nathaniel smiled. He believed the future still belonged to him. Across the city, Emily Hawthorne was experiencing a different kind of anticipation. Her apartment had slowly filled with small signs of preparation over the past week. Garment bags hung inside the closet. A pair of ivory heels waited beside the door. Invitations had not been printed. The ceremony was private, but a handful of close friends had received messages asking them to attend. Emily stood in front of her bedroom mirror that Thursday evening, holding the white dress against her shoulders again. "You're nervous," Nathaniel said from the sofa. Emily glanced back at him. "Of course I'm nervous." Nathaniel crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her waist. "It'll be fine," he said. "Everything is already arranged. What about Felicity?" Nathaniel exhaled quietly. "We'll tell her afterward." Emily studied his reflection in the mirror. "You're sure?" Nathaniel nodded. "She trusts me." Emily hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I guess she always has." Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and warm sunlight drifting across the quiet Chicago streets. Felicity woke early, long before Nathaniel. She dressed simply dark slacks, a soft gray blouse, and a light coat. Her appearance was neat but unremarkable, the kind of clothing that would allow her to move through a public space without drawing attention. Before leaving the bedroom, she paused beside the closet. Nathaniel's suits hung in careful rows, each one pressed and organized. Felicity reached for the garment bag he had placed there the night before. Inside was the navy suit Nathaniel reserved for formal events. She closed the bag again gently. In the kitchen downstairs, Felicity prepared coffee, as she always did. When Nathaniel entered 20 minutes later, he looked unusually energized for a Saturday morning. "Early start today," he said casually. "I have some research work to finish downtown," Felicity replied. Nathaniel nodded. "That's good." His tone carried relief he did not realize he was revealing. After breakfast, Nathaniel left first. Felicity watched through the living room window as his car disappeared down the street. Only then did she retrieve the folder Margaret Collins had helped assemble. The documents were organized neatly in sections. At the very top rested a single printed page, the confirmation email from the Grand Lakefront Hotel. Felicity placed the folder inside a simple leather briefcase. Then she picked up her keys and left the house. The drive into Chicago took nearly 40 minutes. Traffic moved steadily along Lakeshore Drive as the morning sun reflected across Lake Michigan. Felicity kept both hands calmly on the steering wheel, her mind moving through the timeline she had memorized over the past 2 weeks. Nathaniel would arrive at the hotel shortly before noon. Emily would already be there, preparing in the bridal suite. The ceremony itself was scheduled for early afternoon. Felicity parked 2 blocks from the Grand Lakefront Hotel. The building stood tall beside the water, its glass windows reflecting the blue sky above. Valets moved efficiently at the entrance, greeting guests and guiding cars into position. Inside the lobby carried the quiet elegance of a luxury hotel. Tall white arrangements of roses stood near the reception desk. Soft piano music drifted through the open space. Guests moved calmly between elevators and seating areas. For a moment, Felicity stood just inside the entrance, observing the room. Everything looked exactly as the confirmation email had promised. A small sign beside the elevators listed the day's private events. Lakeview Suite, private ceremony. Felicity walked toward the seating area near the lobby windows and chose a chair with a clear view of the main entrance. She placed the briefcase beside her feet and folded her hands calmly in her lap. The clock above the reception desk read 11:47 a.m. 10 minutes later, the revolving doors turned again. Nathaniel Hawthorne stepped inside. He wore the navy suit Felicity had seen hanging in the closet that morning. His posture was confident, his expression composed. In his right hand, he carried a small white box, a ring box. Nathaniel paused briefly near the front desk, speaking quietly with the receptionist before moving toward the elevators. He never noticed Felicity sitting across the lobby. The elevator doors opened. Nathaniel stepped inside. The doors closed. Felicity remained seated for several seconds after the elevator disappeared from view. Then she stood. She adjusted the strap of the briefcase on her shoulder and walked slowly toward the elevators. Inside the mirrored walls of the elevator car, her reflection looked exactly as it always had. Calm, composed, unreadable. She pressed the button for the top floor. As the elevator began its quiet ascent, Felicity thought briefly of the timeline she had built. The restaurant charges, the hotel reservations, Emily's messages, Nathaniel's explanations. Every detail had led to this moment. The elevator stopped. The doors opened into a quiet hallway lined with white flowers and soft lighting. At the far end of the corridor stood a door partially open. Inside the room, voices moved softly between laughter and conversation. Felicity walked forward slowly. From where she stood in the hallway, she could see into the bridal preparation room. Emily Hawthorne stood near the mirror. She was wearing a white wedding dress. For several seconds, Felicity simply watched. Emily smiled at one of her friends while adjusting the lace along the sleeve. She said Nathaniel should be here any minute, the friend said. Emily's expression brightened. He will be. Felicity stood perfectly still in the hallway. Neither Emily nor the others in the room noticed her presence. For a moment, The silence around Felicity felt deeper than anything she had experienced before. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just the quiet confirmation of something she had already documented. Emily Hawthorne was waiting for Nathaniel Hawthorne, waiting to become his bride. Felicity turned away before anyone inside the room could see her. The hallway remained empty as she walked calmly back toward the elevator. Downstairs, the hotel lobby continued its peaceful routine. The ceremony upstairs had not begun yet, but Felicity Hawthorne already knew something Nathaniel and Emily did not. The story they believed belonged to them had already been recorded, and the record was about to speak. Felicity Hawthorne did not return to the elevator immediately. Instead, she paused halfway down the quiet corridor where a tall window overlooked the wide blue surface of Lake Michigan. The sunlight outside reflected softly against the glass, filling the hallway with a pale brightness that made everything appear almost unreal. Behind her, inside the bridal suite, laughter rose briefly again. Emily's voice carried through the slightly open door lighter than Felicity remembered, almost breathless with excitement. For a moment, Felicity stood very still. The sound of her sister's voice was not unfamiliar. She had heard it for years at family dinners, holiday gatherings, and quiet Sunday visits. But hearing it here, wrapped in the language of anticipation and ceremony, felt like listening to a conversation that had never been meant for her ears. Inside the room, someone said the photographer should be here soon. Another voice added, "Nathaniel will probably come up once the guests arrive." Emily laughed softly. "He's always early," she said. Felicity closed her eyes briefly. Nathaniel had always been early. Early for meetings, early for flights, early for appointments that required precision and careful timing. She wondered if he realized how much that habit had helped her. The elevator doors opened at the end of the hallway. Nathaniel stepped out. He adjusted the sleeve of his navy suit and glanced toward the bridal suite door, smiling slightly as he walked down the corridor. Felicity watched him from the shadow beside the window. Nathaniel did not see her. He stopped outside the bridal suite and knocked lightly before stepping inside. The laughter inside the room grew louder. Felicity heard Emily say his name. Nathaniel. There was a moment of soft commotion, movement, greetings, the quiet rustle of fabric. Then Nathaniel's voice answered her. "You look beautiful." The words drifted into the hallway as easily as any other conversation. Felicity remained standing beside the window. For several seconds, she considered walking forward. The door was still open. If she stepped inside now, the ceremony would end before it began. Nathaniel's expression would shift from confidence to shock. Emily's excitement would collapse into confusion. But Felicity Hawthorne had not spent the last 2 weeks assembling evidence for a moment of shouting in a hotel hallway. Confrontation would give them something they did not deserve. A scene, emotion, confusion strong enough to bury the facts she had worked so carefully to preserve. Felicity turned away from the bridal suite. Her shoes made almost no sound as she walked back toward the elevator. Behind her, inside the room, Emily was speaking again. "Everything is ready downstairs," Nathaniel answered calmly. "Yes. The officiant arrived earlier. We'll go down in about 15 minutes. Felicity reached the elevator and pressed the call button. When the doors opened, she stepped inside and descended quietly to the lobby. The hotel remained as elegant and peaceful as it had been when she arrived. Guests had begun to gather near the event entrance, friends of Emily's perhaps, or colleagues, who believed they were attending a small private wedding. A few people held glasses of champagne. A staff member adjusted the arrangement of white roses near the doorway. The atmosphere carried the quiet excitement of celebration. Felicity walked through the lobby, slowly observing everything. The details mattered. Margaret Collins had explained that documentation was strongest when supported by context. Witnesses, timelines, locations. Felicity paused near the front desk and approached the same event coordinator she had spoken with earlier on the phone. Robert Klein recognized her voice immediately when she introduced herself. "Miss Hawthorne," he said politely. "Is everything all right with the reservation?" Felicity smiled faintly. Yes, I simply wanted to confirm the ceremony schedule. Robert glanced at his tablet. The ceremony begins at 12:30 in the Lakeview Suite event room. Guests will be seated shortly. Felicity nodded. Thank you. She stepped away from the desk and moved toward a quiet seating area near the windows. From there, she could see the entrance to the event room clearly. At 12:22 p.m., the doors upstairs opened again. The elevator descended. Nathaniel and Emily emerged together a moment later. Emily's white dress moved softly as she stepped into the lobby, the long train gathered carefully by one of her friends. Nathaniel stood beside her, his hand resting lightly against her back. The two of them looked exactly like what the guests believed they were. A bride and groom preparing for their wedding. Several people nearby applauded softly as Emily entered the room. Someone raised a phone to take photographs. Nathaniel smiled politely at the guests, accepting their congratulations, with the calm confidence that had always made people trust him. Felicity watched quietly from across the lobby. For a brief moment, Nathaniel's eyes moved across the room. They passed directly over Felicity without stopping. He did not recognize her. Perhaps he did not expect to see his wife sitting calmly in the audience of his second wedding. Emily turned toward the event room entrance. Her friends gathered around her, adjusting the folds of her dress. Nervous, one of them asked. Emily laughed softly, a little. Nathaniel leaned closer to her. Everything's perfect, he whispered. Felicity rose slowly from her chair. She did not approach the ceremony doors. Instead, she walked toward the far end of the lobby, where the hotel's quiet lounge overlooked the lake. From there, she could still see the guests entering the event room. The ceremony would begin in minutes. Felicity opened her briefcase and removed the folder Margaret Collins had assembled. Inside were the documents that now told the full story. Bank records, email confirmations, security documentation, the timeline that traced Nathaniel's deception from its first small inconsistencies to the present moment. Felicity closed the folder again. Upstairs, the elevator doors opened once more. The officiant stepped out, adjusting his jacket as he walked toward the ceremony room. Moments later, the event doors closed behind the guests. The wedding had begun. For several seconds, Felicity remained standing beside the window, watching the calm blue water beyond the glass. She did not feel the anger many people expected in situations like this. What she felt instead was clarity. Nathaniel and Emily believed that they had reached the most important moment of their plan. The moment where their secret would finally become real. But Felicity Hawthorne understood something they did not. The ceremony upstairs meant very little legally. Nathaniel was still married. Their union, celebrated quietly in a hotel ballroom, existed only inside the illusion they had built together. The real consequences were waiting elsewhere. Felicity closed the briefcase and walked calmly toward the exit. Outside, the wind coming off the lake carried a cool freshness that made the afternoon feel sharper. She walked 2 blocks back to her car and placed the briefcase on the passenger seat. Before starting the engine, she opened her phone. Margaret Collins answered on the second ring. "Hello, Felicity. It's confirmed," Felicity said quietly. "They're having the ceremony now." Margaret's voice remained steady. "Did you see them together?" "Yes." "Good," Margaret replied. "That completes the record." Felicity looked out through the windshield toward the distant shape of the hotel. For a moment, she imagined the scene inside the ballroom. Emily walking toward Nathaniel, guests smiling, champagne waiting for the celebration afterward. Nathaniel believing the difficult part of his life had finally ended. But Margaret Collins's next words reminded Felicity of something important. "Now we move forward." Felicity started the car. "Yes," she said calmly. Across the city, Nathaniel Hawthorne was slipping a ring onto Emily Hawthorne's finger. And neither of them yet understood that Felicity Hawthorne had just finished documenting the moment that would end everything they thought they had built. Felicity Hawthorne did not drive home immediately. Instead, she crossed downtown Chicago in slow afternoon traffic and parked in the covered garage beneath Margaret Collins's office building. The city moved around her with its usual indifference, pedestrians at crosswalks, horns in the distance, the low metallic rhythm of trains passing overhead. There was something almost merciful in that indifference. The world had not paused to witness what had happened at the Grand Lakefront Hotel. It had simply continued. Felicity preferred it that way. By the time she entered Margaret's office, the bridal ceremony at the hotel was likely over. Guests would be congratulating Nathaniel and Emily. Champagne glasses would be lifted. Photographs would be taken. In one version of the day, it would look like the beginning of something. Margaret Collins was waiting in the conference room with a legal pad, a glass pitcher of water, and a stack of folders spread neatly across the table. "You came straight here," Margaret said. "Yes." Margaret studied Felicity's face for a moment, perhaps expecting to find tears or visible collapse. What she found instead was composure sharpened into something cleaner. "Tell me exactly what you observed." Felicity placed her briefcase on the table, removed the folder, and began. She described the top-floor hallway, Emily in the white dress, Nathaniel arriving with the ring box, their exchange outside and inside the bridal suite, the movement downstairs into the event room, the officiant, the guests, the ceremony beginning at approximately 12:30 p.m. Margaret wrote steadily as Felicity spoke. When Felicity finished, Margaret closed her notebook. "That helps," she said. "You were careful with your observations. I wanted the timeline clean." "It is." Margaret reached for one of the folders on the table and opened it. "I also received something from the hotel's legal department about an hour ago. They won't release footage voluntarily without formal process, but they did confirm the retention schedule for the lobby and event entrance cameras. How long? 30 days unless we move quickly with preservation requests." Felicity nodded once. "Then we move quickly." Margaret watched her for a second. "You understand that once we start this formally, Nathaniel will know he's lost control of the situation." Felicity's expression did not change. "He should?" Margaret gave a slight nod, as if the answer confirmed something she had already concluded. "Then here's what I recommend. We do not confront him tonight. We preserve the evidence first. We prepare the financial dissipation claim carefully. We draft the divorce filing, and we send a preservation notice regarding electronic records and hotel footage before he has any opportunity to shape a different story." Felicity sat down across from her. "What about the ceremony itself?" Margaret folded her hands on the table. "Legally, Nathaniel is still married. Whatever symbolic performance happened in that hotel ballroom today does not erase that fact, but it does demonstrate intent, and intent matters, especially when combined with financial records, concealed transactions, and evidence of premeditation." The word settled between them. Premeditation. That was what it had been. Not confusion, not a temporary lapse, not even an impulsive affair that expanded beyond itself. Nathaniel and Emily had reserved a room, planned a ceremony, gathered witnesses, and arranged a future they intended to reveal only after it had been staged into permanence. They had not merely betrayed Felicity, they had planned around her. Margaret slid a second folder across the table. "I want you to review this checklist tonight," she said. "These are the categories of documents I need over the next 48 hours. Retirement accounts, mortgage records, recent tax returns, insurance policies, shared credit lines, any evidence that marital funds were used for non-marital purposes." Felicity opened the folder. The checklist was methodical, almost clinical. She appreciated that. "If Nathaniel notices I'm gathering records," Margaret's tone remained even. "Then he notices. But do not tell him why, not yet." Felicity looked up, and Margaret paused. "I would recommend no direct contact at all. Not by phone, not by text, not in person. Let silence do its work." Silence had always done its work. That was one of the things Nathaniel and Emily had misunderstood most completely about her. They had treated her restraint as passivity because they confused volume with strength. They believed the loud person held power in a room. They believed the person who demanded, performed, or dramatized controlled the pace of events. But silence, when paired with records, could become structure. And structure could become consequence. When Felicity left Margaret's office, the afternoon light had begun to thin toward evening. She drove home through familiar roads, past places that now seemed to belong to a former arrangement of her life. The house was quiet when she arrived. Nathaniel had not returned yet. Felicity set her briefcase on the kitchen table and stood for a moment in the stillness. The room looked exactly as it had: that morning coffee mug in the sink, a folded dish towel beside the stove, sunlight fading across the hardwood floor. If anyone had walked in at that moment, they would have seen a peaceful American kitchen at the end of an ordinary Saturday. They would have been wrong. Felicity went upstairs and opened the home office cabinet where their household files were kept. Inside were labeled folders, arranged alphabetically, and then by year: mortgage, utilities, taxes, insurance, investment summaries, bank statements. Nathaniel had always admired how organized she was. He had never considered that one day the same habit might become dangerous to him. Felicity carried 3 folders downstairs and spread them across the dining table. She opened her laptop beside them and began scanning, sorting, renaming, and backing up files. Each document was duplicated into secure folders and external storage, exactly as Margaret had instructed. She worked for nearly 2 hours without interruption. At 7:12 p.m., Nathaniel came home. Felicity heard the front door open, then close. His footsteps crossed the entryway with an ease that told her he felt no need for caution. When he entered the kitchen, he looked almost refreshed. There was the faint flush of alcohol in his cheeks, and his expression carried the loose confidence of someone returning from a successful event. "Still working?" he asked lightly. Felicity glanced up from the laptop. "I needed to organize some records." Nathaniel loosened his tie and set his keys on the counter. "On a Saturday, yes." He smiled as though her answer amused him. "You always did have better discipline than the rest of us." The words hung there for a moment. Felicity noticed the phrasing. The rest of us. Not a confession, not even close. But perhaps something in him was unusually relaxed tonight. Perhaps secrecy, when it believed itself safe, tended to soften its edges. "How was your day?" Felicity asked. Nathaniel walked to the refrigerator and took out a bottle of water. "Long," he said. "Client meeting ran over." He twisted the cap open and drank. "Downtown, yes? Productive?" He nodded, more or less. Felicity held his gaze for one steady second longer than usual. Nathaniel met her eyes and saw nothing that required defense. He looked away first. "That's good," she said. Nathaniel stood in the kitchen for another minute, speaking casually about traffic, an upcoming project, and something one of his colleagues had said over lunch. Felicity listened with the same polite attentiveness she had used for years. He was still performing normalcy for her, and because he believed the performance was working, he added more detail than necessary. That too was useful. Eventually, Nathaniel went upstairs to shower. Felicity waited until she heard the bathroom door close before opening the checklist Margaret had given her and adding a new note beneath the day's date. Returned home at 7:12 p.m., claimed client meeting downtown. Displayed no concern, no disclosure. Then she saved the file. A few minutes later, her phone lit up with a message from Emily. "Hey, busy day. I'll call you tomorrow." Felicity looked at the message for a long moment. No apology, no hesitation, no visible guilt. Just a casual text sent from the other side of a betrayal Emily apparently believed was still hidden. Felicity did not reply. Instead, she took a screenshot and forwarded it to a secure folder. Then, she turned the phone. She faced down on the table. Upstairs, water ran through the pipes as Nathaniel showered in the house he still believed he controlled. Across the city, Emily Hawthorne was likely removing the white dress, replaying the ceremony in her mind, imagining herself at the beginning of a future she thought had finally opened. Neither of them understood that the most important decision Felicity made that day was not to appear in the ballroom. not to shout in the hallway, not to expose them while the flowers were still fresh. It was this. She had chosen not to confront. And because of that, everything they had tried to conceal was still intact, still traceable, still vulnerable to law. Felicity closed the laptop and gathered the folders into a neat stack. Tomorrow she would continue. Tonight, silence would remain exactly where it belonged on her side. Sunday morning arrived with a quiet gray sky stretched across the suburbs outside Chicago. Inside the Hawthorne house, the air carried the ordinary stillness of a weekend morning. The coffee machine hummed softly in the kitchen as Felicity Hawthorne poured 2 cups and set them on the table. Nathaniel entered a few minutes later, freshly showered, dressed in a casual sweater instead of the formal suit he had worn the previous day. He looked relaxed, perhaps even lighter. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Felicity replied. Nathaniel sat down and took the cup she had prepared. He scrolled briefly through messages on his phone before setting it aside. "How's your research project coming along?" he asked. "Steady," Felicity said. Nathaniel nodded, satisfied with the answer. For several seconds, the two of them sat quietly at the table, the quiet rhythm of their marriage playing out exactly as it had for years. Anyone looking through the kitchen window would have seen nothing unusual, a married couple sharing coffee in a peaceful home. But beneath the calm surface, the shape of their lives had already begun to change. After Nathaniel finished his coffee, he stood and stretched. "I might run downtown later," he said casually. "Work just tying up a few loose ends." Felicity watched him carefully as he spoke. Nathaniel's voice carried a faint tone of anticipation, something just beneath the surface of his words. It was the tone of a man who believed he had accomplished something important the day before. Perhaps Felicity thought he was expecting Emily to call. Perhaps he believed they would begin discussing the next step of their plan. Nathaniel picked up his phone again and glanced at the screen. "Actually," he said, "I might step out for a bit." "Of course." He paused in the doorway. "You'll be home, yes?" Nathaniel nodded and left the house. Felicity waited until the sound of his car disappeared down the street. Then she opened her laptop. Margaret Collins had sent 3 emails early that morning. The subject lines were simple and professional. Evidence preservation notice. Financial dissipation documentation. Initial filing preparation. Felicity opened the first message. Margaret had already drafted a formal preservation notice, requesting that the Grand Lakefront Hotel retain all video recordings from the lobby and event entrance for the date of the ceremony. The letter cited potential legal proceedings. If the hotel received the notice in time, the recordings could not legally be erased. Felicity read the document carefully before replying with a single line. "Please proceed." She opened the second email. This message contained a detailed summary of the financial analysis Daniel Brooks had helped prepare. The numbers were arranged in a clear table. Restaurant expenses connected to Nathaniel's unexplained evenings. Hotel reservations, transportation costs, jewelry purchases. When combined, the amount totaled nearly $23,000. All withdrawn from the marital account. All connected to dates Nathaniel had described as business travel. Felicity leaned back slightly in her chair. $23,000. Margaret's explanation from the previous day returned to her mind. Financial dissipation. It was not simply a betrayal of trust. It was a misuse of shared property. She added the financial summary to the folder Margaret had created for the case. The third email contained the preliminary draft of the divorce filing. Margaret had written it with careful restraint. No emotional accusations, no dramatic language. Just a precise sequence of facts. Nathaniel Hawthorne had entered a pattern of deception. He had used marital funds for the benefit of a relationship outside the marriage. He had attempted to establish a ceremonial marriage with another person while still legally married. The document did not mention Emily by name yet. That would come later. Felicity read the draft slowly. Then she closed the file. Across the city, Nathaniel Hawthorne was seated at a small cafe near Emily's apartment. Emily arrived 10 minutes late, her hair still slightly damp from a morning shower. The white wedding dress was gone now. She wore jeans and a soft blue sweater, but there was a brightness in her expression that had not been there before. Nathaniel stood when she approached the table. "Hey," she said quietly. "Hey." They sat down together. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emily reached across the table and touched Nathaniel's hand. "We actually did it," she said. Nathaniel smiled. "Yes." Emily exhaled slowly. "I still can't believe it." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. "It's just the beginning." Emily glanced around the cafe before lowering her voice. "When are you going to tell Felicity?" Nathaniel's expression grew thoughtful. "Soon." How soon? Nathaniel hesitated. "After I speak with a lawyer." Emily's smile faded slightly. "You didn't already?" Nathaniel shook his head. "I wanted to handle the ceremony first." Emily studied his face carefully. "You're sure she doesn't suspect anything?" Nathaniel's confidence returned quickly. "No." Across the cafe window, cars moved steadily through the Chicago streets. Nathaniel watched them for a moment before continuing. "Felicity avoids conflict. She always has." Emily nodded slowly. "So when you tell her, she'll be upset," Nathaniel admitted. "But she won't make a scene." Emily took a sip of coffee. "And the divorce?" Nathaniel shrugged lightly. "It'll take time." Emily's voice dropped slightly. "And us?" Nathaniel leaned forward. "We'll figure it out." The conversation drifted into plans after that. Apartments, future travel, possibilities that seemed clear to them because the most important piece of information remained hidden. Neither Nathaniel nor Emily knew that Felicity Hawthorne had already spoken with Margaret Collins. Neither of them knew that the financial records had been analyzed. Neither of them knew that a legal preservation request was already on its way to the Grand Lakefront Hotel. Back in the quiet suburban house, Felicity continued working through the document checklist Margaret had provided. Mortgage records were scanned. Insurance policies were copied. Retirement account statements were downloaded. Each file was organized into folders labeled clearly with dates and descriptions. Felicity worked methodically, pausing only occasionally to review the timeline she had built over the past month. The pattern was now unmistakable. Nathaniel's deception had not been random. It had been planned. When the clock on the kitchen wall reached noon, Felicity closed the final folder and backed up the files onto an external drive. Her phone vibrated on the table. A message from Emily. "Can we talk later?" Felicity read the words twice. Then she placed the phone back down. She did not respond. Silence, she had learned, had a particular kind of power when used correctly. Across the city, Emily was still sitting across from Nathaniel in the cafe. "What if she finds out before you tell her?" Emily asked suddenly. Nathaniel shook his head again. "She won't." Emily studied his face. "You sound very sure." Nathaniel smiled. "I am." Back at the Hawthorne house, Felicity opened the timeline document one more time. She added a final note beneath the morning's entries. Emily message received, "Can we talk later? 11:56 a.m. Then she saved the file. The timeline had grown long now, long enough that anyone reading it would see the truth clearly. And Felicity Hawthorne understood something Nathaniel and Emily still did not. The longer they continued believing their secret was safe, the more complete the record would become. Every conversation, every transaction, every lie. Each one quietly strengthening the case that was already taking shape. Monday morning returned the Hawthorne household to the quiet rhythm of the work week. The sky outside Chicago carried the pale blue of early summer, and sunlight spread across the kitchen floor in long rectangular shapes through the tall windows. Felicity Hawthorne sat at the dining table, with her laptop open, reviewing a spreadsheet Margaret Collins had sent late the previous evening. The document outlined every financial transaction connected to Nathaniel Hawthorne's activities over the past 8 months. It was longer than Felicity had expected. Daniel Brooks had discovered additional charges once he looked deeper into the shared account history. Some were small rideshare trips, parking garage fees, late-night restaurant payments. Others were larger and more deliberate. Hotel deposits, jewelry purchases, event planning fees. Together they told a story more clearly than any accusation could. Nathaniel had not been careless. He had simply believed no one was looking closely enough. Felicity added several annotations to the spreadsheet and saved the updated file. Upstairs, Nathaniel's alarm rang. He came down 15 minutes later wearing a dark suit and carrying his briefcase. His mood remained noticeably light. Busy week ahead, he said while pouring himself coffee. "Is it several meetings?" he replied casually. "Some important ones." Felicity nodded. She wondered whether any of those meetings involved lawyers of his own. Nathaniel glanced at his phone and smiled faintly. "Emily says hello, by the way." Felicity looked up from the laptop. "Oh, she texted last night. What did she say?" Nathaniel shrugged. "Just checking in." Felicity held his gaze for a moment. "And you?" I told her everything's fine. Nathaniel sipped his coffee. The lie arrived easily wrapped in the calm tone he had used for years whenever he wanted to end a conversation without inviting further questions. Felicity returned her attention to the laptop. "Good." Nathaniel finished his coffee and picked up his briefcase. "I'll be late tonight," he said. "Work again?" "Yes." Felicity nodded. Nathaniel leaned down briefly and kissed her cheek. "See you later." Then he left. From the kitchen window, Felicity watched his car disappear around the corner. Once the house grew quiet again, she opened the email Margaret Collins had marked urgent. The message contained an audio file. Margaret's explanation appeared beneath it. One of the restaurant managers where Nathaniel frequently met Emily has security recordings with audio near the bar area. This conversation occurred 3 weeks ago. It may be useful. Felicity hesitated before pressing play. At first, the recording carried only background noise, voices clinking glasses, faint music. Then 2 familiar voices became clear. Nathaniel's voice spoke first. "We should keep the ceremony small." Emily laughed softly. "I'm not asking for a big wedding." "It's not about that," Nathaniel said. "Then what timing?" Emily's voice lowered. "You mean Felicity?" There was a pause. "Yes." Emily sighed. "She'll survive." Nathaniel's answer came without hesitation. "I'll handle the divorce once everything is settled. And after that, then we tell people." Emily laughed again, lighter this time. "People will think it happened fast." Nathaniel's voice softened. "That's why we keep the ceremony quiet." The recording ended. Felicity sat very still for several seconds. The words themselves did not surprise her. She had already known the truth they contained. But hearing them spoken, hearing Nathaniel discuss the sequence of betrayal with such calm planning gave the evidence something else. Intent, Margaret Collins called later that afternoon. "I assume you listened to the recording?" "Yes." Margaret's voice remained steady. "It strengthens the timeline considerably." "Is it admissible?" Possibly, Margaret said. "The recording occurred in a public restaurant where there's no expectation of privacy. We'll evaluate it carefully." Felicity looked again at the transcript Margaret had attached. Nathaniel's voice on the page sounded colder than it had in the recording. "I'll handle the divorce once everything is settled." The sentence carried a certain quiet arrogance, as if Felicity herself were nothing more than a task to be completed. Margaret continued speaking. "There's something else you should know. What is it Nathaniel appears to have contacted a law firm this morning?" Felicity felt no surprise. "How do you know one of the partners there and I have worked opposite each other before?" "They reached out to confirm whether I already represent you." "And you said I said yes." Felicity closed her eyes briefly. Nathaniel had begun preparing his own version of events. Margaret continued. "That means he suspects the marriage may be ending soon?" "Does he know I know no?" Felicity leaned back in her chair. "He probably believes he's preparing first." Margaret's tone carried a hint of approval. "That assumption works in our favor." Across the city, Nathaniel Hawthorne sat in a quiet conference room at a downtown law firm. The attorney across the table was younger than Margaret Collins, with an efficient manner and quick eyes. So the lawyer said, folding his hands, "You're considering divorce?" Nathaniel nodded. "Yes." "Is your spouse aware?" "Not yet." The lawyer made a short note. "And you're currently involved with someone else?" Nathaniel hesitated briefly. "Yes." "Anyone your spouse knows?" Nathaniel looked away for a moment. "My sister-in-law." The lawyer's pen paused above the paper. "That adds complications." Nathaniel shifted slightly in his chair. "We had a private ceremony this weekend." The lawyer leaned back slowly. "Mr. Hawthorne, you're still legally married." "I know." The lawyer sighed quietly. "Then the situation is more serious than you might realize." Nathaniel frowned. "What do you mean? If your spouse can show financial misuse, deception, and intent surrounding that ceremony, the court will look at the case very closely." Nathaniel's confidence faltered slightly. "It was private." "That doesn't necessarily matter." Nathaniel leaned forward. "What should I do?" The lawyer's answer was careful. "For now, we prepare. Documentation, disclosure, negotiation, strategy." Nathaniel nodded slowly. Back in the Hawthorne house, Felicity had already added the audio transcript to the evidence folder. She reviewed the timeline again. Every piece now connected. Financial records, emails, hotel reservations, audio evidence, witnesses at the ceremony. The structure Margaret Collins had described during their first meeting was nearly complete. Silence had allowed the truth to remain intact long enough to be documented. And now the documentation itself was becoming something stronger. A legal narrative. At 6:45 that evening, Nathaniel returned home. He entered the kitchen with a slightly tense expression of a man who had spent the day thinking carefully. "How was your day?" he asked. "Quiet." Nathaniel nodded. He stood beside the counter for a moment before speaking again. "Felicity." "Yes, I've been thinking about some things." Felicity waited. Nathaniel hesitated, then stopped himself. "Never mind," he said. "We'll talk later." Felicity watched him leave the kitchen. Nathaniel believed he was approaching a moment of control, the moment when he would reveal the truth on his own terms. But what Nathaniel Hawthorne still did not understand was this: the story he thought he was preparing to tell had already been written, and the evidence was almost ready to be placed on the table. Tuesday morning arrived with the quiet certainty of routine. Felicity Hawthorne stood in the kitchen beside the window, watching the early sunlight move slowly across the neighboring lawns. The neighborhood was awake now. Cars reversing from driveways, distant voices calling children towards school buses, the quiet sounds of a weekday beginning. Behind her, Nathaniel Hawthorne moved through the house with a faint restlessness that had not been there before. He checked his phone more often than usual. He lingered near the kitchen doorway instead of leaving immediately. Felicity noticed every detail. Nathaniel finally spoke as he fastened his watch. "Do you have any plans today, work?" Felicity said. Nathaniel nodded, though he didn't appear to be listening fully. He seemed to be measuring something in his own mind. The attorney he had visited the previous day had left him unsettled. What had begun as a confident plan, a quiet ceremony followed by a controlled divorce, had suddenly grown more complicated once legal language entered the conversation. Financial exposure, disclosure obligations, potential court scrutiny. None of it had been part of the future Nathaniel imagined when he slipped the ring onto Emily's finger 3 days earlier. Now he was beginning to realize something. If Felicity chose to fight, the situation could become messy. Nathaniel studied Felicity as she sat calmly at the table, reviewing documents on her laptop. She looked exactly the same as she always had. Quiet, focused, almost distant. Nathaniel had always interpreted that calm as weakness. Now, for the first time, he wondered if he had misunderstood it. "You've been working a lot lately," he said. "Yes." "Everything all right?" Felicity looked up briefly. "Of course." Nathaniel nodded slowly. He wanted to say something more, perhaps to begin shaping the conversation that would eventually lead to divorce. But something about Felicity's composure made him hesitate. Instead, he grabbed his briefcase. "I'll see you tonight." "All right." Nathaniel left the house. The silence that followed was deeper than usual. Felicity waited until his car disappeared down the street before opening the email Margaret Collins had sent earlier that morning. The subject line read, "Next phase preparation." Inside the message, Margaret had outlined the next step in careful detail. The divorce filing was nearly complete. But Margaret recommended one additional stage before formally submitting the documents: controlled disclosure. Margaret explained it clearly. In high-conflict divorces involving financial deception, it was sometimes useful to present evidence gradually in a formal setting before final court filings. This often occurred during early legal conferences or structured negotiation meetings. The purpose was simple: allow the truth to appear piece by piece. Let the opposing party attempt explanations. Then place documentation beside those explanations. Contradictions tended to reveal themselves naturally. Margaret had already scheduled the first formal legal meeting for Friday afternoon. Nathaniel and his attorney had agreed to attend. Felicity read the message twice. Then she replied with a single sentence: "I'll be there." Across the city, Emily Hawthorne sat in her apartment staring at her phone. The excitement that had filled her over the weekend had begun to fade into something less comfortable. Nathaniel had sounded distracted the previous evening when they spoke. And now, 3 days after the ceremony, nothing in his life had visibly changed. He was still living with Felicity, still going to work, still telling Emily to give it a little time. Emily walked toward the mirror in her bedroom. The wedding dress now hung inside a garment bag in the closet. For a moment, she considered calling Felicity. The thought had been growing quietly in her mind since Sunday. Part of her believed it would be easier to speak first to soften the truth before Nathaniel delivered it. But another part of her hesitated. If Felicity became angry, everything might become chaotic. Emily picked up her phone. Then she set it down again. Across town, Nathaniel Hawthorne sat inside his office, staring at the draft divorce strategy his lawyer had emailed him that morning. The document was longer than he expected. It mentioned financial disclosure, asset division, legal timelines. Nathaniel rubbed his forehead slowly. None of this had seemed complicated when he first began seeing Emily. Back then, the future had appeared simple. But now the process had begun to look like something else entirely. A negotiation, a risk. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. Perhaps it was time to speak to Felicity directly. If he explained things calmly, she might agree to a reasonable settlement. Felicity had always preferred peace over confrontation. Yes, that would be the best approach. Nathaniel checked the time. He would talk to her that evening. Back in the Hawthorne house, Felicity continued working through Margaret's preparation list. She organized printed documents inside labeled folders: financial records, communication transcripts, the restaurant audio recording, the hotel reservation confirmation, and finally, the timeline. By mid-afternoon, the evidence file had grown thick enough that the folder barely closed. Felicity placed it inside her briefcase. For several seconds, she sat quietly at the dining table. She knew exactly what Nathaniel believed would happen next. He believed he would control the narrative. He believed he would explain the situation in calm, reasonable terms. He believed Felicity would react with hurt, perhaps even tears. But ultimately, she would accept the outcome. He had always mistaken silence for surrender. That misunderstanding was about to become expensive. Nathaniel returned home just after 7 that evening. He entered the house slowly, as if rehearsing a conversation in his mind. Felicity was in the living room reading. "Nathaniel," she said calmly. "Felicity." He sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nathaniel cleared his throat. "There's something we need to discuss." Felicity closed the book gently. "Yes." Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his hands together. "I've been thinking about our marriage." Felicity waited. Nathaniel continued. "I believe we've grown apart." His voice was careful, measured, the way consultants delivered difficult news to clients. I think it would be best if we considered separating. Felicity looked at him quietly. Nathaniel expected a reaction. Shock, confusion, anger. Instead, Felicity simply nodded. I see. Nathaniel hesitated. That's all for now. Nathaniel frowned slightly. I thought you might want to ask questions. I'm sure we'll have many conversations, Felicity said. Nathaniel felt a small ripple of unease. Felicity's calmness was not what he expected. Still, he continued. I've already begun speaking with a lawyer. Felicity nodded again. That's reasonable. Nathaniel leaned back slightly. Then you understand? Yes. Nathaniel stood. I'm glad we can handle this like adults. Felicity watched him walk toward the stairs. Just before he disappeared into the hallway, she spoke again. Nathaniel. He turned. Yes, there's a legal meeting scheduled this Friday. Nathaniel blinked. What meeting with Margaret Collins? Nathaniel's expression shifted. You've already hired a lawyer, yes? Nathaniel frowned. When a while ago. The room grew very quiet. Nathaniel studied her carefully now. You've been planning this? Felicity held his gaze. I've been preparing. Nathaniel felt the first true thread of concern tighten in his chest. What exactly are you preparing? Felicity's voice remained steady. Clarity. Nathaniel said nothing. Upstairs, the house remained silent. But something important had changed. For the first time since the ceremony, Nathaniel Hawthorne realized he might not be the one controlling the conversation. And on Friday afternoon, the truth waiting inside Felicity's briefcase would finally begin to speak. Friday afternoon arrived with a quiet, overcast sky hanging low above downtown Chicago. The city streets moved with their usual rhythm taxis pulling into narrow spaces along the curb, office workers crossing intersections. With coffee cups in hand, the low murmur of conversations drifting through glass office towers. Inside one of those towers on the 15th floor, Margaret Collins' conference room waited in calm stillness. The room had been arranged deliberately. A long polished table stood in the center. 4 chairs faced each other across its surface. A small carafe of water rested beside neatly stacked legal pads. The atmosphere carried the quiet neutrality that law offices often cultivated spaces designed to hold difficult conversations without emotion spilling over. Margaret Collins arrived first. She placed 2 folders on the table, both thick with carefully organized documents. One belonged to Felicity Hawthorne. The other was a duplicate set of selected materials that would be revealed gradually during the meeting. A few minutes later, Felicity entered. She wore a dark navy blazer and carried the same leather briefcase she had brought to the hotel a week earlier. Her posture was straight, her movements unhurried. Good afternoon, Margaret said. Good afternoon. Felicity sat beside Margaret and placed the briefcase on the table. Are you ready? Margaret asked quietly. Yes? Margaret studied her client for a moment. Many people arrived at meetings like this, visibly shaken. Others came angry, determined to argue. Felicity carried neither expression. She looked composed, prepared. Margaret appreciated that. At exactly 2:03 p.m., the conference room door opened again. Nathaniel Hawthorne entered with his attorney. The lawyer was a man in his late 30s named Christopher Alden. Sharp-featured, professionally confident, and already aware that the meeting would likely involve uncomfortable facts. Nathaniel's expression remained controlled as he walked into the room. He glanced briefly at Felicity before sitting across from her. Felicity, he said. Nathaniel. Christopher Alden introduced himself and shook Margaret Collins' hand. Margaret returned the greeting with equal politeness. Once everyone was seated, the room grew still. Christopher Alden spoke first. My client and I understand this meeting concerns the dissolution of the Hawthorne marriage. Margaret nodded. That is correct. Nathaniel folded his hands on the table. I'm hoping we can handle this efficiently, he said. Margaret's voice remained calm. That depends on the clarity of the facts. Nathaniel leaned slightly back in his chair. I've already explained to Felicity that I believe the marriage has run its course. Margaret opened the first folder. Yes, We're aware of your position. She slid a single sheet across the table. This is a summary of financial activity connected to the marital account over the past 8 months. Christopher Alden picked up the document first. His eyes moved quickly down the columns. Restaurant expenses, hotel charges, transportation receipts, jewelry purchases. He glanced briefly at Nathaniel. Are these accurate? He asked. Nathaniel frowned. They appear to be ordinary expenses. Margaret's voice remained even, not entirely. She opened the second folder. These transactions correspond with a series of meetings between Mr. Hawthorne and another individual. Nathaniel shifted slightly in his chair. Christopher Alden looked at him again. Nathaniel exhaled. Yes, I've been seeing someone. Christopher Alden nodded slowly. That's not uncommon in divorce cases. Margaret turned another page. This particular relationship, however, involved the use of approximately $23,000 of marital funds. Christopher Alden's expression tightened slightly. That number would need to be verified. It has been, Margaret replied. She slid another document across the table. This one contained the detailed breakdown Daniel Brooks had prepared. Christopher Alden studied it carefully. Nathaniel watched the document pass between the lawyers with growing unease. Margaret continued speaking. Financial dissipation of marital assets is one matter. She paused. But there is a second issue. Nathaniel frowned. What issue? Margaret opened another section of the folder. The Grand Lakefront Hotel. Nathaniel's posture changed almost immediately. Christopher Alden looked up. What about it? Margaret placed a printed email on the table. The reservation confirmation for a private ceremony booked under Nathaniel Hawthorne's name. Christopher Alden read the document slowly. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Where did you get that? He asked. Margaret did not answer the question. Instead, she slid another sheet forward. This reservation included a bridal preparation suite. Christopher Alden looked at Nathaniel again. Nathaniel's voice was tight. It was a private event. Margaret nodded calmly. Yes. She turned one more page, and the bride listed for that ceremony was Emily Hawthorne. The room became very quiet. Christopher Alden stopped writing. His pen hovered above the legal pad for several seconds before he lowered it slowly. Nathaniel, he said quietly, is that correct? Nathaniel did not answer immediately. Across the table, Felicity remained completely still. She had not spoken once since the meeting began. Margaret continued. The ceremony occurred last Saturday at approximately 12:30 p.m. in the Lakeview Suite Ballroom. Christopher Alden leaned back in his chair. You conducted a wedding ceremony while still legally married. Nathaniel's voice dropped. It was symbolic. Margaret placed another document on the table. The ceremony was witnessed by several guests and officiated by a licensed officiant. Christopher Alden closed his eyes briefly. This complicates things, he said quietly. Margaret nodded. Yes. Nathaniel's voice rose slightly now. This has nothing to do with the divorce itself. Margaret met his gaze evenly. It has everything to do with intent. She opened the final section of the folder. And we also have supporting audio evidence. Christopher Alden looked up sharply. Audio. Margaret slid the transcript across the table. Christopher read the highlighted lines silently. Emily's voice, Nathaniel's voice. We keep the ceremony quiet. I'll handle the divorce once everything is settled. Christopher Alden placed the transcript down slowly. Nathaniel stared at the page. His earlier confidence had disappeared completely now. The room had shifted. He could feel it. Margaret finally folded her hands together. Mr. Hawthorne, she said calmly, our position is straightforward. Nathaniel said nothing. Margaret continued. Your actions constitute financial dissipation deception regarding marital assets and a deliberate attempt to establish a second marital relationship before the legal dissolution of the first. Christopher Alden spoke carefully now. What is your client requesting? Margaret turned to Felicity. For the first time since the meeting began, Felicity Hawthorne spoke. Her voice was quiet, measured. I'm requesting the truth be recognized. Christopher Alden waited. And legally, he asked. Margaret answered. A fair division of marital assets, full financial disclosure, and compensation for dissipated funds. Nathaniel leaned forward suddenly. You're making this a spectacle. Felicity met his eyes calmly. No. Her voice remained steady. You did that. The room fell silent again. Nathaniel realized something in that moment that had not fully settled in his mind until now. Felicity had known, not just recently, for weeks, perhaps longer. And during that time, she had not shouted. She had not argued. She had not even confronted him. She had simply documented everything. The realization felt heavier than any accusation. Across the table, Margaret Collins closed the folder gently. This meeting is only the beginning, she said. And Nathaniel Hawthorne finally understood something he had never considered before. Felicity Hawthorne had not been quiet because she was powerless. She had been quiet because she was building the case. The silence that followed Margaret Collins' final statement was not dramatic. There was no shouting. No one slammed their hands against the table. But something important had shifted in the room. Nathaniel Hawthorne felt it immediately. For years, he had understood conversations like negotiation spaces where confidence, timing, and persuasion could reshape outcomes. That was the skill his career had trained him to rely on. When a discussion began poorly, he simply adjusted the narrative. But the papers on the table were not part of a conversation. They were a record, and records did not bend easily. Christopher Alden leaned forward slowly, his expression now far more cautious than it had been at the beginning of the meeting. Nathaniel, he said quietly, I need you to answer something clearly. Nathaniel kept his eyes on the documents. Yes. Did the ceremony at the Grand Lakefront Hotel occur exactly as described here? Nathaniel hesitated. For a moment he considered denying it. But the evidence laid across the table made denial pointless. Yes, he said. Christopher Alden exhaled quietly. Margaret Collins did not react. She had expected that answer. Christopher continued carefully. And Emily Hawthorne, your sister-in-law, was the bride. Nathaniel nodded once. Yes. Christopher leaned back again, pressing his fingers against the bridge of his nose for a moment. This creates significant legal exposure. Nathaniel's voice sharpened slightly. It wasn't a legal marriage. That isn't the issue, Christopher replied. The issue is intent and financial conduct. Across the table, Felicity Hawthorne watched the exchange without interruption. She did not appear satisfied. She did not appear angry. She simply listened. Margaret Collins opened the folder again and slid another document across the table. This is the full financial timeline, she said. Christopher Alden studied the pages carefully. Restaurant charges, hotel deposits, transportation, the jewelry purchase. Each entry connected to a specific date. Each date matched communications and travel claims Nathaniel had made to Felicity. Christopher's voice was quieter when he spoke again. These transactions were all paid from the marital account. Margaret nodded. Yes. Christopher turned toward Nathaniel. Why Nathaniel shifted in his chair? It was temporary. Christopher stared at him. Temporary, I intended to reimburse the account later. Christopher did not respond immediately. He had practiced family law long enough to recognize a losing explanation when he heard one, non-instant. Across the table, Margaret closed another section of the folder. There is also the matter of the audio recording. Christopher Alden lifted the transcript again. He read the highlighted lines silently one more time. Then he looked up. Nathaniel, this conversation occurred before the ceremony, yes. And you discussed delaying the divorce until after the ceremony. Nathaniel rubbed his forehead. It was a complicated situation. Christopher lowered the paper. That's one way to describe it. The room remained calm, but the weight of the discussion had grown heavier. Nathaniel glanced at Felicity. She had still said almost nothing. For years, Nathaniel had believed he understood her silence. He had assumed it meant she was unwilling to confront conflict. Now he realized something else. She had been listening, gathering, waiting. Margaret Collins spoke again. "Mr. Alden, our intention is not to prolong this unnecessarily." Christopher nodded. "That would be ideal," Margaret continued. "But we will require full financial disclosure and acknowledgement of dissipated marital funds." Christopher looked at the documents again, then at Nathaniel. "We can discuss settlement parameters," he said carefully. Nathaniel leaned forward. "This is ridiculous." Christopher turned toward him. "No, Nathaniel, it's not." Nathaniel's voice rose slightly. "She's trying to punish me." For the first time, Felicity spoke again. "No." Nathaniel looked at her sharply. Felicity's voice remained calm. "I'm asking the truth to be acknowledged." Nathaniel laughed bitterly. "You've turned this into a courtroom." Felicity met his gaze. "You did that when you started lying." The words were not loud, but they landed with a quiet finality. Christopher Alden shifted the conversation back toward practical matters. "Margaret," he said, "what exactly is your client requesting?" Margaret folded her hands together. A fair division of marital assets, reimbursement for dissipated funds, and a straightforward dissolution of the marriage. Christopher nodded slowly. "That is not unreasonable." Nathaniel stared at him. "You're taking her side." Christopher's voice remained calm. "I'm advising you." Nathaniel looked back at Felicity again. "You planned this." Felicity did not deny it. "I prepared." Nathaniel shook his head. For how long? Felicity paused before answering. "Long enough." Christopher Alden closed the financial summary. "We should take a short break," he said. Margaret agreed. The lawyers stepped out of the conference room, leaving Nathaniel and Felicity alone at the table for the first time since the meeting began. The silence between them stretched for several seconds. Nathaniel spoke first. "You went to the hotel?" It was not a question. Felicity nodded. "Yes." Nathaniel stared at her. "You watched the ceremony?" "Yes." Nathaniel's voice dropped. "Why didn't you stop it?" Felicity considered the question. "Because the ceremony wasn't the problem." Nathaniel frowned. "Then what was?" Felicity gestured slightly toward the document spread across the table. "The deception." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. "You could have confronted me weeks ago." "Yes." "So why didn't you?" Felicity answered without hesitation. "Because then you would have erased the evidence." Nathaniel fell silent. For a long moment, neither of them spoke again. Finally, Nathaniel said quietly, "You really think you've won something here?" Felicity shook her head. "This isn't about winning." Nathaniel's expression hardened. "Then what is it about?" Felicity's voice remained steady. "Clarity." Nathaniel looked down at the transcript again, at his own words, at the timeline, at the numbers. For the first time since the ceremony, the future he had imagined began to feel uncertain. The door opened again. Margaret Collins and Christopher Alden returned to the room. Christopher sat down and placed his legal pad on the table. "I believe we can move towards settlement discussions," he said. Nathaniel looked up slowly. Margaret nodded. "That would be appropriate." Christopher continued. "But I want to be clear about something first." He turned toward Nathaniel. "The evidence presented today is substantial." Nathaniel said nothing. Christopher's tone remained professional. "If this proceeds to court, the documentation will likely carry significant weight." Nathaniel's shoulders sank slightly. The room grew quiet once more. Across the table, Felicity Hawthorne sat exactly as she had since the meeting began. Calm, composed, and almost impossibly still. For months, Nathaniel had believed he was managing a secret. What he had actually been doing was writing a record. And now the record was speaking louder than any explanation he could offer. The break in the conference room had been brief, but when the lawyers returned to the table, the atmosphere had shifted again. The conversation was no longer about discovery. It was about consequence. Christopher Alden sat down slowly, his posture more measured now. The confidence he had carried into the meeting earlier had been replaced with something closer to caution. Across from him, Margaret Collins closed the evidence folder and placed her hands calmly on the table. For several seconds, no one spoke. Nathaniel Hawthorne sat with his shoulders slightly forward, his gaze fixed on the documents that had dismantled the narrative he believed he could control. Christopher finally cleared his throat. "I think we all understand the situation more clearly now." Margaret nodded. That was the purpose of today's meeting. Christopher turned toward Nathaniel. "Before we discuss settlement terms, I want to ask something directly." Nathaniel looked up. "Yes." Christopher spoke carefully. "Did you use marital funds for the ceremony at the Grand Lakefront Hotel?" Nathaniel hesitated only briefly. "Yes." Christopher nodded once and wrote something down on his legal pad. "And the ring purchase, yes. And the hotel reservations over the past several months." Nathaniel exhaled slowly. "Yes." Christopher set the pen down. "That simplifies certain parts of the process." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, the energy that had once fueled his arguments fading into a quiet resignation. Across the table, Felicity Hawthorne remained composed. She had not moved much during the entire meeting. But there was something unmistakable in the stillness she carried. Not triumph, not satisfaction, simply completion. Margaret Collins spoke again. "Given the evidence presented, our proposal remains straightforward." Christopher Alden looked up. "Please explain." Margaret slid a document across the table. It was a formal settlement outline. "The marital property will be divided equally," Margaret said, "with an adjustment accounting for the documented dissipation of approximately $23,000. Christopher read the numbers carefully. Nathaniel leaned forward. "You want me to pay it back?" Margaret met his eyes calmly. "Yes." Nathaniel let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "You're serious?" Margaret did not respond. Christopher continued reading the document. "There's also a provision regarding the house," he said. Margaret nodded. "Felicity will retain the property. Mr. Hawthorne will receive a financial offset from other marital assets." Nathaniel looked at Felicity. "You're keeping the house," Felicity answered simply. "Yes." Nathaniel shook his head slowly. "This is unbelievable." Christopher turned toward him. "Nathaniel." Nathaniel looked at his attorney. "You're not going to challenge this?" Christopher's voice remained calm. "The documentation is very strong." Nathaniel leaned back again. "And if I refuse," Christopher held his gaze, "then the case proceeds to court." Nathaniel said nothing. Christopher continued carefully. "And if it proceeds to court, the same documents will appear in front of a judge." The room grew very quiet again. Nathaniel's eyes moved slowly across the table. The financial timeline, the reservation confirmation, the audio transcript. Each page was a piece of something he had once believed was hidden. Now it looked less like evidence and more like a mirror. Felicity watched him without expression. She had not come here to humiliate him. She had come to finish something. Christopher spoke again. "I recommend we consider settlement seriously." Nathaniel rubbed his temples. "You're telling me to give up?" Christopher shook his head slightly. "I'm telling you to recognize the situation." Nathaniel looked toward Felicity. "You're enjoying this?" Her answer came quietly. "No." Nathaniel frowned. "Then why do this?" Felicity paused before responding. "For the same reason I documented everything." Nathaniel waited. "Because the truth matters." Nathaniel's expression hardened again. "You could have just walked away." "Yes." "Instead, you built a case." "Yes." Nathaniel shook his head. "I don't understand you." Felicity's voice remained steady. "You didn't try." The words landed softly, but they ended the argument. Christopher Alden picked up the settlement document again. "Margaret, if we make a few minor adjustments regarding the retirement accounts, I believe we can reach agreement." Margaret nodded. That would be acceptable. For the next 30 minutes, the conversation turned technical. Asset distributions, tax considerations, legal language. Nathaniel participated less and less. Most of the discussion occurred between the lawyers. Occasionally, Christopher asked Nathaniel for confirmation. Each time, Nathaniel answered with shorter responses. Yes, fine, whatever. At last, Christopher set his pen down. I believe we have a workable framework. Margaret closed the folder. I agree. Christopher turned toward Nathaniel. This settlement avoids prolonged litigation. Nathaniel stared at the table. Christopher waited. Finally, Nathaniel nodded. Fine. Margaret made one final note. We will draft the official documents and circulate them for signature. Christopher stood. That's acceptable. The meeting had taken less than 2 hours. But the life Nathaniel Hawthorne had imagined for himself had changed completely during that time. The ceremony at the hotel had felt like the beginning of something new. Instead, it had become a piece of evidence. The lawyers gathered their papers. Christopher stepped toward the door. Nathaniel, he said quietly, we should go. Nathaniel stood slowly. For a moment he looked toward Felicity. You really planned all this? Felicity met his eyes. I prepared. Nathaniel exhaled. Then he turned and followed Christopher out of the room. The door closed behind them. Margaret Collins remained seated across from Felicity. Well, she said softly. Yes, Felicity replied. Margaret studied her client carefully. You handled that remarkably well. Felicity did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked at the folder on the table. Inside were the records she had spent weeks assembling, the quiet evidence of a marriage ending. Finally, she closed the folder. It's finished, she said. Margaret nodded. Almost. Felicity stood and picked up her briefcase. Through the tall windows behind Margaret's desk, the afternoon light had begun to soften over the Chicago skyline. The city looked exactly the same as it had that morning. But Felicity Hawthorne understood something clearly now. The hardest part had never been discovering the truth. The hardest part had been waiting long enough for the truth to stand on its own, and now it had. The final papers arrived 3 weeks later. By then, the early summer heat had settled over Chicago in long, warm afternoons that stretched into quiet evenings. The Hawthorne house stood on its familiar street exactly as it always had. Gray siding, trimmed hedges, the same small maple tree near the front steps. Inside the house, however, the atmosphere had changed in ways that were difficult to describe. Nathaniel Hawthorne had moved into a short-term apartment downtown while the settlement documents were finalized. His belongings were gone from the closet upstairs. His books had disappeared from the shelves in the study. The house had grown quieter. Not empty, just clear. Felicity Hawthorne sat at the dining table with a thin stack of legal papers in front of her. The documents were precise and unremarkable to anyone unfamiliar with the story behind them. A formal dissolution of marriage, asset distribution, financial reimbursement for dissipated marital funds. Nothing in the language described betrayal. Nothing in the language mentioned Emily Hawthorne. The law rarely concerned itself with the emotional shape of a story. It concerned facts, and the facts had now been recognized. Margaret Collins sat across from Felicity with a pen resting beside the final page. You can take your time, Margaret said. Felicity nodded. She read the final paragraph again. The marriage between Felicity Hawthorne and Nathaniel Hawthorne is hereby dissolved under the laws of the state of Illinois. 9 years of marriage summarized in a single sentence. Felicity signed the page calmly. Margaret collected the documents and added her own signature where required. It will be filed this afternoon, Margaret said. Felicity thanked her and stood. The legal work was finished, but closure rarely arrived at the same moment as paperwork. Later that evening, Felicity returned home. The house greeted her with the quiet familiarity she had known for years. But without Nathaniel's presence, the silence felt different. Not tense, not heavy, just peaceful. She walked slowly through the rooms. The living room looked almost untouched. The books remained on the shelves. The photographs still rested in their frames, vacations, family gatherings, moments that had once belonged to a shared life. Felicity paused beside one photograph in particular. It showed the three of them standing together several years earlier. Felicity, Nathaniel, Emily. The image captured an afternoon on the lakeshore, sunlight bright across the water behind them. Everyone in the picture was smiling. Felicity studied the photograph for a moment longer. Then she placed it carefully into a drawer. Not destroyed, not displayed, just removed from the wall. Her phone vibrated on the table. A message from an unfamiliar number. She opened it. Felicity. It's Emily. The text paused there for several seconds before the next message appeared. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. Felicity read the words without reacting. Another message arrived. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Felicity set the phone down without replying. Across the city, Emily Hawthorne sat in a small apartment that suddenly felt much quieter than it had a few weeks earlier. The ceremony that had seemed so certain now felt distant. Nathaniel's divorce settlement had forced them to reconsider many of the plans they had imagined together. Some of those plans had already begun to unravel. Emily stared at the phone screen, waiting for Felicity's response. None came. Back in the Hawthorne house, Felicity walked out onto the back patio. The evening air carried the soft warmth of early summer. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor's radio played faint music. Felicity sat in one of the patio chairs and watched the sky slowly darken. For weeks, she had been focused on documentation, records, timelines, evidence. Now those tasks were finished. The silence that remained felt different. It was no longer the silence of observation. It was the silence of completion. Inside the house, the phone vibrated once more. Emily had sent another message. I never meant to hurt you like this. Felicity returned inside and looked at the screen. For a long moment, she considered whether to respond. There were many things she could say. Questions, anger, accusations. But none of them would change what had already happened. And Felicity Hawthorne had never believed that closure required the final word. She turned the phone face down on the table. The message remained unanswered. Across the city, Nathaniel Hawthorne sat alone in his apartment, staring at a stack of documents identical to the ones Felicity had signed earlier that day. The settlement had been finalized. The house was no longer his. The financial reimbursement had been transferred. The marriage had ended, not with shouting or scandal, but with signatures and records. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. For the first time since the ceremony at the hotel, he allowed himself to think about the moment Felicity had stood quietly in the conference room. The way she had watched the evidence unfold without raising her voice. He realized something now that he had not understood then. Felicity had never needed to win an argument. She had simply waited long enough for the truth to win it for her. Back at the house, Felicity turned off the kitchen lights and walked upstairs. The bedroom felt larger now, more open. She placed her briefcase on the dresser and removed the final folder Margaret Collins had returned to her that afternoon. Inside were the documents that had ended her marriage. Felicity closed the folder and placed it in the cabinet beside her other records. Then she closed the cabinet door. Somewhere outside, the wind moved softly through the trees. Felicity stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the quiet street. The past months had revealed many things: deception, ambition, betrayal. But they had also revealed something else. Strength did not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looked like patience. Sometimes it looked like silence. And sometimes it looked like a woman who walked away from a broken story without needing to shout the ending. Felicity Hawthorne turned off the light, and for the first time in many weeks, the house finally slept. The story of Felicity Hawthorne does not end with a courtroom victory or a dramatic confrontation. There were no shouted accusations in a hotel ballroom, no public humiliation, no revenge. What remained instead was something quieter, a woman who chose to observe before reacting, to document before accusing, to let the truth grow strong enough that it no longer needed her voice to defend it. In a world that often celebrates loud victories, Felicity's strength was different. She didn't destroy the people who betrayed her. She simply stepped out of the story they had tried to build around her. And when the truth was finally placed on the table, emails, bank records, recordings, timelines, no one needed to raise their voice. The facts spoke clearly enough. Sometimes justice arrives like a storm, but sometimes it arrives quietly, in signatures, in documents, in the calm decision to walk away with dignity intact. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Stories like this travel farther than we expect, and it's always meaningful to see how many different corners of the world are listening. And if you believe stories about quiet strength, truth, and dignity deserve to be told more often, you're welcome to subscribe and follow the channel. Not for noise, just for more stories that remind us that sometimes the strongest ending is the one that doesn't need to shout.